What would you do if a 600-pound grizzly started moving straight toward your children? Freeze, run, or fight with everything you had? The clip you just saw wasn't filmed on a hunting trip. It wasn't sport, it was adrenaline. It was the moment a father stood in the open woods, his 2 young sons behind him, facing a predator inches from taking their lives. In the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, one man had seconds to choose: hesitate and lose everything, or act. One shotgun, one shot, one decision that would divide millions. Before anyone judges him, they need to understand the story behind this moment. Dan Walker, wasn't a thrill seeker. He was a 42-year-old carpenter who moved his family to the Bitterroot Mountains for peace, not danger. Their small cabin sat tucked between towering pines, far from city noise, but close enough to the wilderness that wildlife sightings were simply part of life. His wife, Emily, embraced the quiet. Their sons, 10-year-old Noah and 7-year-old Jacob, spent their days exploring trails, collecting pine cones, and learning the land alongside their father. It was simple, it was safe. Or so they believed. A few weeks before the incident, neighbors reported an unusually large male grizzly roaming closer to homes. It had raided trash bins, torn through sheds, and left deep claw marks on trees near the Walkers' property. Dan tried to stay calm for the boys' sake, but he remembered something they couldn't forget. 2 years earlier, during a family hike, Jacob had a near encounter with a black bear. Though Dan managed to scare it off, the moment left a shadow of fear that never fully left the child. As sightings of the grizzly increased, the Walkers avoided the woods behind their home. Still, the bear kept pushing closer, bold, unafraid, and Dan felt danger closing in long before the world saw it. Dan hoped the grizzly was just passing through. He prayed it wouldn't return. But the wilderness doesn't make promises, and danger doesn't always stay in the shadows. And within days, that danger stepped closer. It began with small disturbances. A low fence behind the cabin crushed overnight, splintered as if something massive had leaned its full weight against it. At first, Dan tried convincing himself it could have been an elk, but the next morning ended that hope. Fresh claw marks, carved deep across a pine tree near the boys' play area. They were high, far too high for anything except a fully grown grizzly staking its claim. Then came the nights. Long after Emily and the boys were asleep, Dan would lie awake listening to slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, a rhythmic huffing, the soft crunch of leaves under enormous paws. By morning, trash cans were dragged into the woods, lids twisted and crushed as if they were toys. The message was unmistakable. The bear wasn't afraid. When Dan called wildlife officers, he heard the usual lines: keep the area clean, make noise, it'll move on. But the bear didn't move on, it moved in. Noah stopped going near the back porch. Jacob refused to sleep unless Dan kept the hallway light on. Emily checked the doors 3 times each night, hands shaking more than she admitted. Dan stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Boots stayed by the door, flashlight on the table, and the 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with slugs, never left his reach. Because this wasn't curiosity anymore, it was a warning, a threat edging closer to the family he'd die to protect. Days passed and everything felt normal, until it wasn't. That morning felt strangely peaceful. Soft light filtered through the pines, and for once, the forest behind the cabin was quiet. Noah and Jacob were outside near the edge of the yard, tossing pine cones and racing each other toward the tree line. Emily stood on the porch watching them, grateful to see them laughing again. For a moment, Dan truly believed the tension of the past weeks was fading. Then he heard it, 2 high-pitched screams. Emily's coffee hit the floor. Dan's heart dropped. He sprinted to the door just as the boys' terrified voices carried through the trees. The grizzly had stepped out of the timberline, massive and silent, closing in on the boys with slow, deliberate strides. Emily ran after Dan, tears already streaming. "Dan, stay back," he yelled, stopping her with one hand. "Stay at the house." He grabbed the 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with slugs from the rack inside the doorway, and bolted toward the woods, boots pounding the dirt. The boys were backing up fast, their eyes locked on the advancing bear. Dan knew he had only seconds. One wrong move, and he'd lose them both. Everything was about to change. Dan burst into the open woods, the 12-gauge shotgun already shouldered, boots grinding into the dirt as he fought to steady his aim. Ahead of him, the grizzly was advancing. Slow at first, then faster, closing the distance between itself and his sons with terrifying confidence. Noah and Jacob were backing up, steps trembling, eyes wide and locked on the predator towering before them. "Back up! Back up!" Dan shouted, voice shaking, adrenaline burning through every nerve. There was no time to think, no time to breathe. Dan planted his feet, raising the shotgun. No scope, no distance, no second chances. Through the bead sight, the bear's features sharpened, matted fur, flared nostrils, black eyes fixed on the smallest target. This wasn't a warning display. It wasn't curiosity. It was an attack forming in real time. He had 1 second, maybe less. The bear stepped closer, muscles tightening as it prepared to lunge. Dan exhaled, forcing the world around him into silence. His boys were right behind him. The bear was right in front of him. Instinct screamed to fire now. Hesitation whispered he was already too late. He pulled the trigger. The shotgun slug hit with brutal force, the blast ripping through the stillness of the woods. The grizzly staggered mid-step, collapsing forward into the dirt, only yards from where the boys had been. In one instant, the threat ended. In one shot, his children were still alive. For a moment, no one moved. Not the birds, not the wind, not even Dan. The ringing in his ears slowly faded, replaced by the shaky, uneven breaths of his sons. Jacob was the first to move, running straight into his father's arms, sobbing so hard his whole body shook. Noah followed, clinging to Dan's leg, his small hands trembling uncontrollably. Emily came running from the cabin, tears streaking down her face, choking on her own breath as she repeated the same words over and over. "You're safe, you're safe, you're safe." Dan lowered the 12-gauge, his hands shaking so hard he could barely control it. The adrenaline drained from his body in a single wave, leaving him weak, weightless, barely able to stay on his feet. He looked at the fallen grizzly, lying motionless in the dirt, an animal powerful enough to tear through all three of them, now still. There was no triumph, no rush. Only the crushing realization of how close he had come to losing everything. Emily called the local authorities, voice cracking as she tried to stay composed. Within the hour, 2 wildlife officers arrived. After examining the bear, they confirmed what Dan feared. It had been reported multiple times. It was a predatory male known for aggressive behavior. If he hadn't acted, the outcome could have been devastating. Dan said nothing. He just pulled his sons closer, holding them like he might never let go. When the footage was uploaded online, the reaction was instant and explosive. Within hours, thousands were arguing in the comments, each convinced they knew exactly what Dan should have done. Support poured in from parents, hunters, and anyone who understood fear in its rawest form. Anything for your family. I'd have done the same. He saved his boys. End of story. But critics spoke up too, calling him reckless, calling him cruel, insisting the bear was just acting on instinct. The debate grew louder, more emotional, more divided. Yet, one truth remained untouched. No one else was there that morning. No one else saw 2 boys trembling behind their father. No one else heard the growl or felt the terror closing in. In the days that followed, the noise online faded, but the weight of that morning never did. Dan never called himself a hero. He never celebrated what happened. He simply held his sons a little tighter, grateful for the chance to do so. People would argue forever about what was right, what was wrong, and what they would have done in his place. But for Dan Walker, the truth was painfully simple. When danger came for his family, he reacted the only way a father could, fast, desperate, and without hesitation. And because of that choice, his sons were still alive. For Dan, that was enough.